story of a miraculous feeding of 5,000 men, plus women and children, and it still speaks to us that when Jesus is in the area, expect a miracle, expect the supernatural. And we remember how for 3 days people had been journeying. Now, they gave a little hint that I want to be journeying early Monday morning to where the sun gets fully blotted out by the moon. If I stay right here, I might see more, but I'll see less because it's not a total eclipse right here in Michigan. But I'm going to try to go and intercept where the sun is going to be completely blotted out by the moon, and that's a once-in-a-lifetime thing for me. I think it's like once every 71 years or something. Probably won't be around for the next time it does it, not in this area. You can fly to various places in the world where you can see those kind of eclipses, but this one's just a few hours drive away. But here these people had heard Jesus was near, and they may have gone, some of them may have gone home at night, but every day for 3 days the crowd had been building. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we had an event that for 3 days people would go home and pretty soon, and probably by the third day, we couldn't fit this little room anymore. We'd have to be somewhere out the way Jesus was on a hillside. There they were. Most of them had gone without food or water for much of those 3 days. Now, food is one thing. Most of us could take a 1 or 2 day fast without too much damage, but water is pretty difficult to go without, and they were needing sustenance, and Jesus knew that, and his compassion. They needed sustenance more than they needed another sermon, and so he didn't preach them a sermon. He asked, is there any food around so that we can feed them? And you remember how the disciples' faith was tested, and but they found a little boy that had brought a lunch. His mother had lovingly cared for his needs, and somebody asked him, would you share that with Jesus? And of course, you remember what happened next. That Jesus prayed and broke the bread and we might say just pulled the fishes apart into pieces. And before you knew it, there was enough food for everybody there and more left over. Wow. Now, we think about that there was something important called the salvation of the earth. But there was something urgent, was the hunger of the people, the actual physical need of the people. And I'm sure Jesus was torn by what we call the pressure, and some people call it the tyranny of the urgent. Sometimes you want to do what's important, but it seems like you're frustrated because all these urgencies are keeping you away from that. I like that little story we told of that mother who took time with God before the day's urgencies came to her. The urgencies of getting food for breakfast and getting the laundry done and all those daily tasks. She took time with Jesus to start her day every day. So, and we do that today. There's things that we call spring chores, and we're ramping up in April for May for spring chores and getting seed into the ground, getting whatever we need to do to have a crop in our garden. And we think of all these chores and they become urgencies, because if you don't get your garden in soon enough, it won't mature before the frost. And so there is a timeliness about a lot of things in life, and there is an urgency in the church as well for its mission. And we need to remember that its mission is both important, but it also finds a way of speaking of urgencies. But Jesus had to set aside some of his former, we might say, hierarchy of things he wanted to do to take care of the urgencies. And he did so knowing that the consequences would be difficult, because when you provide a miracle so people get to eat when they didn't think that there was any food around, and they see that all you have to do is speak and go through some motions and everybody gets fed. When the masses thought about that, they thought, this is the one we have been looking for. This is the king. It can take us out of bondage to the Romans. It can take us out of poverty to debtors. We can move forward with somebody who can supply all our needs. And they began to whisper one another, and the whispers turned to caucuses, and the caucuses turned to this move that we are going to take advantage of this day, because it's more than just a day to eat, it's a day to crown a king. And so they were wanting to seize the day and have Jesus become their new political leader. Now, Jesus knew that if that got any traction, that the moderates would soon be eclipsed by the radicals. I mean, if you have all this power, why don't you just confront the powers that be? And there would be anarchy, there would be crime, there would be bloodshed, there would be all sorts of things that would come along the way that would derail the plan of salvation. People would lose sight of the need to overcome sin in their own lives. All they would be interested in is conquering somebody else so they could be free and have life more their way. So he had to put a stop to this. And with all of the severity that Jesus could do without being irrational about it, he, in no uncertain terms, told his disciples it was time for them to leave. I need you to get in the boat. I need you to take the boat to the other side of the lake. I need you to do that. And of course, they didn't want to do that, but they obeyed. So it says that Jesus immediately made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. How long do you think it took them to get to the boat? 5 minutes maybe? 4 minutes? 3 minutes? I don't know how long did it take them to get into the boat? It says that they dallied at the boat at the water's edge until the sun was going down. In other words, they obeyed halfway. They left him there with the crowd, and they, maybe half a mile away, quarter mile, whatever they were, a few hundred yards away, they were watching the crowd disperse, and all the while they were dallying, delaying, procrastinating, going ahead of Jesus. Never mind, he said, get into the boat and cross over. They obeyed, but they didn't obey. They were reluctant about it. And I think about how often, I remember a book I read, it was a pastor's wife, and of course, at least in former eras, just being a wife meant that you had to kind of support your husband's agenda. You had to kind of do what he wanted to have done, and so she was sublimating a lot of her own needs in her life, and one of those had to do with how she spent her time, and she confessed in this little book that at times she was a reluctant saint. In other words, she did the right thing, but she didn't want to do it. You ever been a reluctant saint? And of course, then there's times when there are cravings that you have, and you realize that maybe it's not the best for your health, but you're going to indulge, and so you put off getting a whole banana split. You know, you just get a scoop of ice cream. But then maybe it's your birthday, maybe somebody else has had a good day, and so this time you splurge and get a whole banana split. So we might say that if that banana split represents an indulgence that you know is not that good for you, you're also a reluctant sinner. You're trying to hold sin at bay. You don't want to become addicted to things which would destroy you, and so you're caught in the middle. Some days you're a reluctant sinner, some days you're a reluctant saint, and you kind of feel like you're treading water with your life because you don't sense you're growing stronger in faith. You don't sense you're making too much progress in holiness, and yet you hope you're not sliding back like Israelites did, and the prophets called them backsliders. We don't like to be known as backsliders. I'll tell you, when I first knew about backsliding firsthand was when I tried to climb up Sleeping Bear Dunes. You wondered, you lifted your leg as high as you could, and you put your weight and you put it in the sand, and it went down, 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 down. And although you stretched maybe 2.5 feet up and you tried manfully with all your exertion to climb that thing, it seemed like after 10 steps you had made like 2 feet of progress. Backsliding. So backsliding is not a fun thing to do, and it's a very frustrating spiritual. To think about where you were with the Lord when you first gave your heart to Jesus, how things all seemed so simple, and Jesus was going to come soon, and you wanted to be on his side, and then came adolescence, and then you came all those things that happen when you leave mom and dad's influence, and you got to decide that your religion now is all up to you. There's nobody going to help you get to church on time. It's got to be you. You can't oversleep and expect somebody to rescue you and say, time to wake up. And so there's a lot of things in the Christian walk that we struggle with as we think about not being that reluctant sinner, not being that reluctant saint. But we have the disciples as an example that it happens to people even close to Jesus. It happened to them. And we don't want it to happen to us. But notice that Jesus is perceiving that this is out of hand. He perceives that this crowd, this great crowd, which is in his favor, they want him too much for the wrong things, that they would take him by the force that they could have. And if he didn't exercise some miracle, he would be forcibly made king. And so he got rid of them quickly before they could act, and departed into a mountain himself alone. And of course, when we say alone, it was alone humanly speaking, but he went into the mountain to be with his Father. He felt safest when he was in prayer, and he felt strongest when he was in prayer. And he felt that the clarification of his mission came when he would spend that quiet time in prayer. And so he never lived a life, not even 1 hour, of self-interest. He was always doing what his Father wanted. And the first thing he needed to do after feeding all those people was a temporal blessing. It blinded their eyes to the spiritual needs. He needed to rescue his life's mission. He needed to get it back on track. He needed some distance from people. And sometimes we need distance from people who would sabotage our life's mission in order to get back on track. But there's always collateral damage, and one of the collateral damages was that his disciples, he had pulled, that they trusted him, but he had pulled out some of their faith and confidence in him, and they weren't all that confident in him as they were dallying. They didn't understand why he was doing what he was doing, why he was so abrupt with them, and they began to grumble. You ever grumble when you don't know what's going on? What's happening with my life? God, why did whatever? And so you end up doing God's will, but you end up doing under protest, just as they did. And there they are. They're beginning to row, but they're resenting the methodology of the master. And I've heard people get upset with the church. Why is the church always doing it this way? Why can't it do this way? And so we can be tested over the methodology of the growing of faith. And of course, we all know that denominations have arisen over methodology. In fact, there is one pastor who was known for his devotedness to methods of growing in faith, and his denomination are called the Methodists. There's other people who aren't so much into Methodism, but they believe in holiness, and we call them Pentecostals. They just show up and experience it. It happens to you if it's done right. You don't have to follow too much of a method. And then along comes the Seventh-day Adventists. You know, it's like one Baptist pastor said to my father in the grocery store. He cornered him. He tried to throw some pork hot dogs into my dad's grocery cart. And my dad says, no, we don't eat that. And he said, oh, come on, Pastor. You don't think you can eat your way to paradise, do you? He says, no, if I read my Bible right, you can eat your way out of paradise. Zing. He got him. You know, there's things that just aren't functional in the Christian walk. And the methodology of Jesus certainly was functional, but the people didn't like it. His disciples didn't like it. And they didn't want to follow. They didn't want to obey. And I'm thinking about this, that Jesus knew his disciples had to have a healing of mind, because at this moment they were a bit embittered. They were a bit upset. They were losing faith in him. They were losing faith in the mission of Jesus. They were believing the crowds. They were thinking that maybe that's the kind of Messiah we really need, and Jesus is just a little too whatever to do it on his own. Maybe we need to help him achieve his agenda. And so while they were dallying, the wind came up. I think it was a lovely late afternoon that they could have made it pretty easily to the other side if they'd been prompt. But they weren't ready to pull on the oars. And so they started rowing, and the wind started blowing against them. So now it's a test, because God in his wisdom is going to make it so they could not accomplish what they really did not want to accomplish. You know how you kind of, if you make it impossible, that's when people kind of lean into it and try to make it happen anyway. Like, why am I doing this? I don't really want to do it. I got to get over there. So there they were, filled with anxiety, filled with stress, and they're wearing themselves out in the middle of the night, going against the wind, and they're making no progress. And this went on for hours. This is the fourth watch. And I think a watch is 2 hours. 3 hours. So fourth watch. It's getting on toward morning. It's still dark, but it's early morning, and here they're rowing, and all of a sudden here comes a light. And they look, it looks like a person, and it's moving across the water, and they are rowing as fast as they can, and this ghost, this apparition, is coming on top of the water faster than they can row. They couldn't get away, so now they're in terror. They don't recognize it's the master. I want you to think about this. They're trying to row upwind. This apparition is moving upwind, and it's like effortless. He's gliding. It's coming. The light is getting brighter, and they are thinking it's a ghost. Now, we all know that there's such a thing as a Holy Ghost, but most ghosts are unholy. And they come connected to the trappings of the occult and the spirits of the dead. And so immediately they are petrified that they are about to be victimized by the devil. He's coming to get them. Sent a ghost to terrorize them. And then Jesus calls out to them out of their terror, "Be of good cheer. It's I, Jesus. Don't be afraid." That's Matthew 14:27. Now you got to love Peter, because he had a grasp on making decisions. Occasionally he was a little too impulsive, but while the others were sitting wondering what to do, Peter had an idea. And it was his way of testing it. He says, "If it really is you, Lord, then command me to come out to you on the water." I don't know that he calculated everything about that, but he was in the moment, certainly, and he wanted to be close to Jesus. And I think he was in the mood for some more spiritual, supernatural evidence. And he heard this being say, "Come." And then when Peter had come down out of the boat, there was a little bit of a rail on there. He climbed over that rail, came down out of the boat, his feet touched the water, and he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Now, I guess this is where you can put yourself into the story. You can put yourself in a story in the position of Jesus. Was he happy that Peter was coming? You could put yourself in the position of the disciples. What is this guy up to today? You know, he's always up to something. Peter's always up to something. And then there's a position of Peter himself. Hey, look, I'm walking on water. So let's just think about that moment, because without the supernatural, this wouldn't be the story. Without the supernatural, you wouldn't get to think about what do you feel when someone else is doing something spiritually and succeeding at it that you never could do. Do you celebrate them? Or do you get envious that somehow they're closer to God and you think that God doesn't love you because they're getting a victory that you don't have yet? How do you process that with your faith? And there are all these minds and all these individuals are involved in this story. And that story is there for us to put ourselves into it. While you're thinking about that, tell a story about an Adventist living maybe 150 years ago. I know it's the late 1800s. I just don't know the exact year. It happened in western Iowa. There were a number of Scandinavians. Some of them were Seventh-day Adventists from Scandinavia. Most of them had exposure to Seventh-day Adventist evangelistic efforts in Iowa, and they became Seventh-day Adventists. And I don't even remember this man's name for positive, but I'm going to call him Lars Hansen because that's a very standard. It's like Bob Jones. It lets you know he's a guy, and he's Scandinavian, and he has a farm there, and he has accepted the three angels' message. He believed Jesus is coming soon. He's keeping the Bible Sabbath, and furthermore, he has been faithfully returning his tithe. And this is a year that the locusts descended. There was about a day worth of warning that it was coming from the west. There was this huge swarm of locusts, and nobody could stop them. And so Farmer Hansen went to the edge of his property by his fence, and he knelt down and he prayed. Lord, you promised you would rebuke the devourer. I'm claiming that. I've been faithful with my tithe. I've been obedient to the commandments. I've been trusting in you. And I'm asking you to glorify your name, to spare this property. Never mind that there's a mortgage on the land, and if my crops are all gone, how will I keep the farm? But Father, I'm trusting you to do something to spare my property. Well, the cloud of locusts came, and in a few moments he would know the answer one way or the other. Here's the promise he invoked in his prayer. I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground, says the Lord of hosts. Now we know that sometimes there's a flock of blackbirds or crows that come, etc., etc. And we think, well, that's a nice coincidental thing where nature pours a vacuum, and where there's a lot of food, here comes a lot of hungry birds. We don't have that quite that way. What we have is a vision of the next day. Everyone else in the county, all the farms around were denuded. You just saw brown, bare ground. But there, right along the fence lines, to the inch, is a patch of green. They refused to eat the grass. They refused to eat the beans. They refused to eat the corn. They refused to eat the potatoes and the crops. They refused to eat anything on Farmer Hansen's property. That is because those locusts obeyed the word of the Lord. Now, I think about that because people drove in from miles around to see it. And they heard the story of his prayer, and they were Bible believing. But Farmer Hansen had a level of faith, because whatever their prayers of faith were, they lost their crops. But Farmer Hansen didn't lose his. And it was an amazement. And a very few of them decided to look into what made Farmer Hanson's faith different from their own? But most of them were content to process it as a wonderment they couldn't quite unravel, and they just thought that he was lucky, etc., and they didn't really change their life. But a few people let that example change the way they worship God. And I think about the Bible stories, a lot of us, we hear them, and we think, wow, that was amazing that Peter walked on water. But we don't let that story change the way we worship God. Not that much. We still go on being reluctant sinners and reluctant saints, and we still believe potentially the big things can happen. But then we look at our life and say, that's for somebody else. Well, I think about this. It's one of my favorite little observations. When God calls you to do something, he always empowers you to be successful in your obedience. As Ellen White wrote in Christ's Object Lesson, all God's biddings are his enablings. So Peter was right when he said, pardon me, command me to come, because if Jesus had asked him to come, then he would succeed. So our part in life is not to figure out how to succeed. Our part is to figure out what is Jesus asking us to do. And then trusting he'll empower us to accomplish it. That's the crux of it. It may be in the zone of the supernatural, maybe in the theater of the absurd, like walking on water, but it may be simply as overcoming a besetting sin. Maybe as simple as going to talk to somebody who in the past had always said no, but coming with one more appeal for them to consider the grace and the goodness of God by a testimony from us rather than a preaching at them. Just, I want you to know what Jesus is doing in my life. I come out with this at back of the end of the story is Peter obeyed, and so can you and I. So I have nothing in the judgment to say, well, Peter could do it and I can't. I can do it too. Peter walked on water. It's a fact. God's no respecter of persons. If we'd have been there and God had asked us to do that and we had climbed over the rail of the boat, we would have walked on water too. It's that absolute and simple. And so when I talk about men who walk on water, I am saying we are the men and women of God who are called by Jesus to walk on water. And we're the ones called to come down out of the boat. Now, I don't know what your boat is, because the boat is a vehicle conveyance, but especially if you're not a good swimmer, a boat is where you don't want to get out of if you can't swim. So it represents human security, a place of human security. It's an instrumentality that ultimately is a locus. It's a signal of you can remain spiritually immature if you stay in the boat. After all, you're still obeying Jesus to get to the other side, but you're getting to the other side in a boat. So what is that boat of your spiritual immaturity? And I'm thinking of some of those. One, the unwillingness to return an honest tithe of your increase, devotion to pulp fiction of books and cinematic script writing, lip service to true health reform, and an aversion to a truly abstemious diet is a dependence on an essential feeding of your carnal nature through addictive behavioral patterns. And we have all sorts of addictive behavioral patterns that get marketed. It's substances that you can stick in your mouth, up your nose. People are doing all sorts of things with various non-food items, ingesting them in some way into their body to cause an altered state of consciousness, and it's addictive. We're doing it. What about the boat called spiritual compromise, because you owe somebody of social influence over you or in their life, and so you end up making a little compromise with what God wants you to do because the power they have over you in your life. You're letting somebody dictate your mission in life rather than God. See, the Messianic mission started out with the feeding of 5,000. But the end of the night, by the next day, Jesus was focusing on the redemption of one man. One man who dared try to walk on water, and did for a while, but then failed when he took more counsel with what he couldn't do normally than what Jesus could do anytime. And we have our moments where we walk on water spiritually. We do things that are supernatural for us. We're out of our element. We end up doing things that we normally couldn't do. But then sometimes when that effect wears off, God needs to redeem us, because we would end up being lower than if we hadn't got out of the boat. We think that maybe our life of faith has been misdirected, it's too impulsive. We go all sorts of reasons. Well, I'll never do that again. Well, that would have been fatal for Peter, because he was answering the call of Jesus. So somewhere after that, it all unraveled, but it wasn't because he answered the call of Jesus. It wasn't because no one's supposed to be able to walk on water. We could say he took his eyes off Jesus. We could say he looked at the circumstances. He resorted to his grounding of normality, what is normal. But the point is, he resorted to prayer in that moment of panic. And there's a time for a nice long prayer to devote ourselves to all the deep things of God and the rush of ideas and emotions. There's times when to get right to the point. And Peter's running out of oxygen, so he gets right to the point, Lord, save me. And I think as much as God likes the hour of meditation, I like the 5-second prayer, Lord, save me. 3-second prayer, whatever it is. He likes that, right to the point, because then he knows he has your attention. And Jesus reached down, and all the walking on water after that was Peter was arm in arm with Jesus. He realized he couldn't do it on his own, and he needed Jesus. And so I like to think, when I get to the reconciliation of this matter, how I would want my story to end. How would I want my story to end? It ends with a miracle in the Bible. Peter and Jesus get in the boat. Immediately, the boat was at the land where they were going. I don't know how that worked. Were they really that distracted? Or in the God of time and space found a way to convey that boat to land, to show them that they never got there because they waited until it was an impossibility, and he's the one that got them to where he had asked them to go all along. I like that part of the story, because my Bible talks to me about that God is going to, in the plan, in the heart of those who don't resist, he will write his law in my heart so that I will not choose to sin anymore. That's a promise. I just tell you, I have enough exposure to life to confess this without undue shame. I've chosen sin instead of Jesus some days. Maybe you have that on your conscience too. I'm not going to say everybody does to make myself feel better, but I know that I have it on my conscience that there were days I chose sin instead of Jesus. But if I don't resist, he will come to me and he will plant a new plan of action in my heart so that I will long, I will hunger for the continual presence of Jesus, the continual smile of his approval in my life, such that I will let him write his law in my heart. And it'll change me. Because the prophet said, can you who are accustomed to do evil actually invent goodness in yourself? Ask a leopard how to get rid of spots. Ask an Ethiopian how to look like a white man. Can't be done. But the God of the supernatural has a mission to have us walking on water until we get to his design shore of safety. That's his plan. That's the gospel. That's the good news. God will get you where you can't get yourself. Just don't frustrate him. Well, notice they came out of the ship now, all of them, they're on the shore. And how do you finish a story like this? They worshiped. And their worship was from the heart. They weren't grumbling. They were praising of a truth. Thou art the Son of God. There is an immeasurable difference between a God who can do anything and we who have a whole list of things we can't do. And so our worship changes when we realize that God is simply asking us to attend to what he's asking us to do, and then he'll give us the power to do it. And if we do that, through acknowledging his power over the universe, surrendering to his power in our life, then we'll begin acting to allow him to fulfill his purpose of grace and truth in the person of a man, a woman, a youth that belongs to Jesus. We'll be different. And I think that that's called walking on water, when you're different in a way you can't do on your own. So I'm praying that we're going to learn before it's forever too late that our destiny really all along was to walk on water.